All right, it's exactly 12 o'clock. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started. We'll get some intros going and then we'll hand it over to the person you are here for, Sai. So let me do a quick intro here. So welcome everyone to Proposal Helper and BidExec's webinar with our very trusted partner, PilieroMazza, who always brings tons of knowledge to our folks. Today's topic that we're going to work on or talk about is decoding the FAR Part 6. What are the implications for small business contracting and the rule of two? As everyone knows, there are lots of changes that are happening with the FAR, and we had a previous webinar that we started talking about some of the changes. Since then, there have been more, and so Sai will fill us in on what's going on with FAR Part 6. Alba is a partner with PilieroMazza, and I'll let him introduce himself here quickly. I am Rita Bhatia. I'm the CEO of ProposalHelper and BidExec.
Yeah, I'm Alba. I'm a partner with law firm of PilieroMazza and in our GovCon group and our business and transactions group. I kind of straddle both of those. And obviously, these FAR changes and what could happen in the near future that we don't know yet. We're going to kind of get into that too. But there's I know a lot of questions out there. So hopefully we'll answer some and we'll go through what we can.
Sounds good. Thanks, Sai. And I'll quickly introduce myself. As I mentioned, I'm the CEO of ProposalHelper. We have been in business for almost 15 years, a little over 15 years now. We have a team of 85 employees. We do not use consultants in our business. And while my background spans 30 years in federal contracting, our folks and our team brings a massive amount of experience in business development and proposal services. So if you need any of those services, please reach out to our team. We'll be happy to support you. Very modular based. It's not a all or nothing. We recognize that every company is different, every project is different. So whatever you need in terms of business development, strategy, growth, and proposal support, we are here for you. With that, I'm going to let Sai take over, introduce what PilieroMazza does, and then get into our topic today. And Sai, if you want to switch over to your slides now, you can do that. And we'll take while Sai is switching over slides, I want to remind everybody to please submit your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll address those at the end. Unless it's very eminent and has to be addressed right away, Sai, I will watch the Q&A box. Folks, I am not going to watch the chat box for questions, so that's for you guys to network. Don't ever lose an opportunity to network with each other. Sai, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, and happy to be here again. Yeah, it's just a little bit about our firm. We tend to practice in a number of different areas: government contracts, our business transactions, M&A practice, labor and employment, litigation, construction. We help everybody from small businesses to larger private equity funds and tribes with pretty much every business need in most cases. So here's just an overview, but happy to help with almost anything that folks need. And yeah, happy to be here. With that, this is just like an overview of kind of what we're going to go through, some of the background of what's happening, some of the issues here with FAR Part 6, the kind of key things that I think from the perspective of some of the small business issues, the set aside questions, the impact on some of the socioeconomic stuff, what it might mean for things in the future, how some of the J&As have changed in the rules, which is not directly related to some of the FAR changes. There's some additional regulatory changes and potential statutory changes that we're also going to get into as we go through some of the key takeaways, how this could impact the rule of two and some of the inflationary adjustments as well. So starting this off, as I'm sure people know, this administration has a goal to completely overhaul the FAR and to strip out anything that is not grounded in statute. that's somewhat of an interesting take or interesting task from my perspective, just because if anyone's ever actually read the implementing statutes of various agencies across the federal government or even programs across the federal government, you'll notice that they're pretty vague. And a lot of the statutes that are out there will ask the administrator or the secretary or whoever is the head of the agency, it'll be directed to them, and it will require them to create regulations consistent with the statute. And the entire structure of administrative law going back to the New Deal and somewhat before that is really structured so that Congress can look at the bigger picture, and the agencies themselves and agency personnel who are truly the experts in areas, because as the world's gotten far more complex than our founding fathers could have ever imagined, and the scope of the federal government has grown beyond probably what they also imagined, you have a scenario where legislators, even at the state level, frankly, can't know everything. And no matter how large the body of legislators are, there's no way they can really understand the nuances of every issue that is being legislated. And so they've passed that on to agency personnel and the heads of agencies and to work with those personnel in order to create regulations, which are still laws, to implement the will of Congress and the will of the people through Congress and the president. So, in that regard, some of what is being looked at here and removed as to what is not in the statute or isn't quote unquote explicitly grounded in statutory authority is somewhat of an open question. And we could see potential lawsuits coming in the future, or maybe even more likely, an unwinding of some of this, probably not over the next few years, but I could see over the next decade or two that what we're going to see, I can almost guarantee you, because this is what happened decades before, is you're going to get this pendulum shift where you've got maybe too many regulations, then there's this big backlash, it goes back the other direction. Then you have either contractors or government personnel or other actors that do things that the government at that time doesn't like. And so they're going to write regulations to plug gaps, which is going to build back up the regulatory structure of everything as we move in that direction. And then maybe you'll see something come back again, but by that time, hopefully, we're all retired. So that's kind of where I see things going. But as of right now, there is this push to remove anything that's not in the statutes. And that, in particular, of what we're talking about in this rewrite of FAR Part 6, is sort of reinforcing that idea. What is important to note, though, is that FAR Part 19, which is the part dealing specifically with implementing the Small Business Act and all the small business rules and regulations, has not been rewritten. And my understanding from talking with SBA and some folks on the Hill is that it's going to be the last part that comes out, because there's still a lot of back and forth and some consternation, maybe infighting between the individuals that are in charge of some of the FAR overhauls and, frankly, House and Senate side folks on both sides of the aisle that I've spoken with. So this would be, Democrats and Republicans who believe that some of the individuals who are rewriting the FAR don't understand the implications or aren't thinking about the implications. And because of that, there seems to be a bipartisan push to potentially push back on some of these FAR overhauls, or to write statutes to overwrite any sort of things that are removed that they don't like. One of those things being the potential rule of two changes, which we haven't seen yet. Again, I'll get into the implications of FAR Part 6 here, but that's really going to be part of the FAR Part 19 overhaul, because the rule of two, as it currently stands, is not statutory. The rule of two exists in its current form as part of FAR Part 19. And so if the FAR overhaul follows the idea of eliminating things that are not explicitly grounded in statute, presumably people are thinking that the rule of two will just completely be eliminated. Now, There have been some pushes, and I'll get into this later too, to actually codify the rule of two and put it into statute. There's been some bipartisan support for that. There have been bipartisan bills that have been pushed forward. There's been hearings, which I'll also get into, that happened a couple weeks ago with the Small Business Committee. I've spoken with folks in the Small Business Committee in the Senate as well as the House, and there seems to be bipartisan support on both sides also to codify this. So that's some good news as far as where things are going, irrespective of some of these FAR overhauls. When you look at FAR Part 6 specifically, though, it really, if you look at the actual language and what has really been changed directly in FAR Part 6, it's largely unchanged in substance. Now, what was removed, though, has led to speculation about what might happen in the future. So, with some of the streamlining of language and a number of provisions that have been removed, there's thought that could foreshadow what is going to happen in FAR Part 19. And as I'll get into, I'm not entirely sure that's the case, especially some of the things that I've spoken with folks on the Hill, and I know some of the back and forth that's been happening behind the scenes. We might not see as sort of dire consequences as folks might believe. And if we do, I think that might actually bolster some of the push to codify things. And it's also important to note for everyone the sort of hierarchy, if you will, of law, right? And for folks who don't know, you've got the Constitution, right, which is at the top. And then you've got laws, which are enacted by Congress and signed by the president, bicameral legislation. And then under that, you've got regulation. Under that, you've got policies and other things. So when you're looking at these things, yes, the regulations are below statute, but if a statute changes, it should immediately impact the law. Like once it's signed by the president, that is the law, as long as it doesn't have some sort of delayed impact, irrespective of what any regulation says. So it essentially overwrites or trumps the regulations because it is superior in this hierarchy, right? Just like if you have a change in the Constitution, you amend the Constitution, to the extent there's any statute inconsistent with that amended portion of the Constitution, it is immediately thrown out, right? It's just abrogated by statute or by the Constitution. So similarly, if we do see a change in the code, that should have immediate impact. Now, you might have certain people, like contracting officers, who might not understand that, or other individuals that are looking at regulations or went through training and might not understand that sort of hierarchy and the implications. So that's something too, that if there are changes that directly impact some of the small business rules and then a statute after, it will be incumbent upon everyone to inform and educate all the government personnel, all of the other individuals you're working with up and down the chain, to make sure they fully understand what the implications are and that some of these things have immediate impact. And that could require protests, it could require litigation, things, unfortunately. But kind of cross that bridge when we come to it. Other things here, there's been a lot of talk about certain things that were changed or removed in FAR Part 6. And in particular, if you look at FAR 6203A, it says that contracting officers may set aside solicitations for small business, right? It goes through and it rewrites certain language to say they may set aside things. And there was thought that, well, you're adding this word or you're using the word may, which doesn't mean must or shall. It just means they can if they want to, not that they're required. So when people read that, they think, oh man, well, that must mean that in FAR Part 19, there's going to be a removal of the rule of two because the rule of two says shall. And so if you have two or more, and for those who don't know, the rule of two is that if you have two or more small businesses that are capable of performing a specific requirement at a fair and reasonable price, then that requirement is supposed to be set aside exclusively for small business participation. So when you say things like may in FAR Part 6, there's people reading the tea leaves that say, well, that must indicate that they're going to change FAR Part 19 to remove the rule of two, to make it so instead of shall or must, it's going to say may, or it's going to say nothing at all about anything with the rule of two. It's just going to be written out of FAR Part 19 entirely. And that's certainly possible. I have no indication. And frankly, even the people, even the senators' offices that I've spoken with and high level personnel within the Senate Small Business Committee and the House Small Business Committee, they've told me they have no idea what is actually going to be put forward in FAR Part 19, but that they are talking with folks inside of the FAR rewrite groups in the various sectors of the government, and that they're pushing this idea that small businesses are a vital component of the government's procurement base and just the general industrialized base of the country. And that by removing this, you're going to cut out the pipeline of growth opportunities for small businesses to succeed both in the federal sector and the commercial sector, which could have dire impacts. So I know that people are pushing to maintain the rule of two and to keep things moving forward. But it's important to note that these changes to FAR Part 6 don't really change what FAR Part 6 already said. So if you look at things like the practitioner album, which you can find online, it's sort of like a companion to the FAR. It's not regulatory, it's not statutory, it really is just policy based. That's supposed to help contracting officers and contracting personnel in the government understand what the FAR means underneath the surface. It's been a long-standing principle, and in fact, in FAR Part 6, it's been long-standing, that there's this discretionary nature to these things, and that they're allowed to do it, but it's not an absolute requirement. Similarly, if you look at some of the small business goals, it's always been a goal, not a mandatory requirement. Now, that being said, the way that the agencies have been pushed to meet these goals is through this rule of two. That's how you sort of ensure that agencies are acting in good faith. But even if you eliminated that, at least in theory, the agency should still be attempting to meet the goals, and the goals themselves are statutory. So that would include the various goals for the various programs, like 8A, Service Able Vet, Woman Owned, Hub Zone, not just small business and full and open, right? There is no just small business goal independent of all the other goals. There are goals for every program in the statute. And that's why the administration, when things changed, one of the first changes they made, right, was to roll back the increases in goals that were done under the Biden administration for the 8A program. In so doing, they reduced them, but only to the point that they were in the statute, which is the same level they've been for decades before Biden increased it. So it's nothing really new. And so I think it's one of those issues where until we see exactly what's happening, everybody should kind of take a deep breath and wait and see what actually occurs. While at the same time, I can assure you that me and many other people have been working with folks on the Hill to push for this idea that should something occur, that there can be a fairly rapid response to re-implement and codify the rule of two or make a stronger language for supporting small businesses, which seems to be a bipartisan objective and an important objective from everyone that I've spoken with. When you look at some of the socioeconomic programs, you'll see, though, in FAR Part 6 that they were consolidated, right? But they weren't completely removed. Now, it used to be that there was this explicit list of the socioeconomic programs, all the ones I just noted, Service Civil Vet, Woman Owned, Hub Zone, 8A, all of these programs. And it said, look, you don't need full and open competition. If you're going to set something aside, you're allowed to set that aside. The new rewritten FAR Part 6 removes the list of the specifics and the references to sole source awards in various programs, but it doesn't eliminate it because this could have been removed because one of the other things that the FAR Rewrite Council, we'll call them, that what they're doing here is consolidating regulations and eliminating superfluous regulations. And so, what this could also indicate is that why have a list or regulations relating to sole source awards and thresholds and things of that nature in FAR Part 6 when they're already in FAR Part 19? And so instead of this idea of just, oh, this means they're removing it in FAR Part 6, that must be a sign they're removing it in FAR Part 19. It could be that they're simply eliminating it in FAR Part 6 because it's already in 19. And you don't need to have references in multiple different places. Now, that might be Pollyannish. People might say that you're crazy. We all know what's really going on. Possibly. But again, I think it's important to wait and see because there's a lot going on behind the scenes there. And as it currently stands, if you look at FAR Part 6 and you read it in conjunction with 19, it would suggest that there's this consolidation going on, not necessarily a scaling back, except to the extent that you're lowering the goals, which has already occurred, down to where they are in statute. And again, they are statutory goals. So the agencies are still supposed to be using their best efforts in order to meet the goals outlined in the Small Business Act. And there isn't a direct indication that FAR Part 19 is going to be completely pulled back to either eliminate the rule of two, although there's been conjecture about that, or completely eliminate the use of certain socioeconomic programs, which I've also heard. And it's important to note there as well that things like the 8A program or the Women-Owned Small Business Program, those are also statutory programs. They're codified in statute. They are not just a creature of regulation. And so there isn't an ability to simply remove or eliminate those programs entirely. Now, that being said, to kind of take off the rose-colored glasses and put on some shades, if you were to look at this and give it the worst possible explanation, if they eliminate the rule of two and they're just goals that are supposed to be met but don't have to be met, they're not a requirement, then could the administration decide that the 8A program or the woman-owned program doesn't align with its objectives, and so therefore, while there are goals, they might miss the goals? Potentially. I do know, though, that there, again, is bipartisan support for all of these programs. There are plenty of 8A companies in blue states and red states and districts. I've spoken with both Republican and Democratic senators and congresspeople about the issues. And no matter who I've been talking to, there is support for this idea that small businesses need to be supported through these programs. And so when you're looking at some of the clarifications here too, like the practitioner Alba I was noting, they did remove information of sort of addressed non-regulatory resources, right? So that's something that they've decided to take out. And then certain outdated or redundant content. And that's also where, because they explicitly noted that there's these non-statutory sources that are being removed. The idea of removing redundancy is where it could suggest, again, that some of these things will still be included in FAR Part 19. They're just removing them from FAR Part 6, because of that redundancy issue. So it's important to look behind what's going on to get a better understanding and some insight into exactly the full scope of what the FAR rewrites are for. It's not just a political exercise, at least ostensibly not just because it's a political exercise. It's also in order to try to streamline things and make things easier to understand, which is not, that general concept is something that could be very helpful. In fact, SBA has done some of that already in its own regulations in FAR Part 13, I'm sorry, just CFR, 13 CFR, not part of the FAR. 13 CFR are all the SBA regulations that the agency itself promulgates to run its programs and to implement the Small Business Act. So those two will not be changed and cannot be changed through the FAR Council. Those are regulations, all of 13 CFR are regulations that are put out by SBA itself. In fact, there's GAO and Court of Federal Claims case law that stands for the proposition that if there is an inconsistency between the FAR, so FAR Part 19 or any part of the FAR, and 13 CFR, that 13 CFR actually trumps and is in that hierarchy I talked about, that 13 CFR is actually higher in the hierarchy than the FAR. So you've essentially got Constitution, statute, FAR Part 13, FAR Part 19, etc. So in that context as well, there are certain things that are in FAR Part 13 that could not be removed simply by removing items in FAR Part 19. Now, the Rule of Two is not one of them, but the programs themselves and the rules for the programs and all of the guidance on the programs, use of joint ventures, the mentor protege, all of that stuff is all in FAR Part 13 and can't just be eliminated or even amended or changed through changes in the FAR. So to the extent that things are changing in FAR Part 19, I'm sure we're going to do something on that too as soon as that comes out. Everybody's eagerly awaiting that, hopefully, probably in the next month, maybe 45 days, something like that. I would think, if not sooner. Then we'll see what happens there, and we could certainly address it as it comes up. Similarly, you've got this idea of, okay, what about justifications and approvals? There was talk that, well, if the small business set-asides are going to be removed, or if they stop using them as much, could there be some argument that is small business set-asides just generally are something other than full and open competition and therefore would require justifications and authorizations, or justifications and approvals, whatever you want to call them, the J&As? In those cases, it still says that, or it used to say, right, that they're not required, and that was removed from FAR Part 6. So, but at the same time, again, you have to look at this in the context of removing redundancies potentially, so that the removal of this idea of not needing a J&A, it now says that they're not required for anything other than full and open competition. Set-asides by statute and in other sections like FAR Part 19 are explicitly not other than full and open competition, right? Once you get to certain thresholds, which we'll talk about in a bit, they can be considered other than full and open competition, but a set-aside in and of itself is not because of other laws, other regulations. So simply removing it from, or this idea from FAR Part 6, is more in line with the idea of removing redundancies than the idea of eliminating small business programs or creating further hurdles for small business set-asides, which I think is where everyone's mind was originally going. Frankly, it could just be clicks. I mean, I hate to say that, but the world we live in, the internet age, there's a lot of hyperbole out there and chasing clicks and chasing likes and all that kind of stuff. And we just should take a deep breath and see exactly what is going to transpire. And again, like I said, there are plenty of people on both sides of the aisle in Congress and elsewhere that are pushing to make sure that small business programs are still alive and well, and that the pipeline for the continued growth of the industrial base through small businesses is robust. And so when you're looking at this from the J&A perspective, you still have J&As required, and I know some of these numbers have just changed recently, which I'll get into in a second. But if you look specifically at FAR Part 6, the old version of this directly said that J&As were required only for sole source awards above the $25 million threshold for 8A, right? And another thing to remember, though, is if you just read the regulation, this has been true for decades. If you just read FAR Part 6 and all these J&A rules, and this used to confuse, or still does confuse, many 8A companies out there, The numbers where you're saying, well, J&As are required for sole source awards above 25 million, even that only applied to tribes, ANCs, and NHOs, right? And as I noted here, and that has now been increased to 30 million. But that increase, or the original 25 million, either way, was not something that directly applied to all 8A companies, because if you look at the way the statute is written, it's very complicated, and frankly, that's something that Congress should change and clarify in the statute. Is that you have to go through multiple different statutes, reading multiple different lines through multiple different amendments over multiple years to actually trace why the 25 million or now 30 applies only to tribes, ANCs, and NHOs and not every 8A company. But when you do that, you'll see that that indeed is the case. And that for standard 8A companies, the sole source threshold to not need a J&A is 4.5 million. That is not in the FAR Part 6 section, though. So that's a good example of where they're tweaking things within FAR Part 6 that don't really change much. So now it's only saying that J&As are required for 8A sole source awards exceeding 25 million, which again has been modified after this rewrite to increases to 30 million. That really isn't changing anything. And that was also a statutory change. So that's where we currently are right now. And if you look at some of these things, you'll see, yes, so non-statutory provisions were removed. The rule of two idea is still floating out there because it has to be looked at in FAR Part 19. But you have these two pieces of legislation here that I references, HR 2804 and Senate 2656, which are bills that have been put forward by both chambers, both houses, chambers of Congress, to try to codify the rule of two and make it law, which again, as soon as that happens, and if it's signed by the president, it would override any attempts to remove it from FAR Part 19 immediately. And it's not something that I think it's the way these work. It's not, oh, we have to get this 2804 and 2656, we have to get them consolidated and they have to go through the process of making sure that everyone agrees. And then that single issue is going to be put into a piece of legislation that is going to make its way to the president's desk to be signed independent of anything else. That's generally how nothing happens anymore that way. It's much more likely that it would be included in some omnibus bill or in the NDAA, which that's where some of the folks I've spoken with, that there's a push to try to get it into the NDAA for this year. Or there's some talk about other legislation that might address certain other regulatory changes that SBA enacted at the end of last year. And these new laws might impact the implication of, or might implicate certain regulations that they changed. And in that legislation, this could be incorporated as well. But I think it's important, to the extent that anyone out there is listening and you have the ear of your senator, congressman, you want to contact them to reference these potential bills to get them to support the legislation here, because I think it is important to let them know, to the extent you haven't already, and push to make sure that they understand that these things are important. Now, in the hearing that occurred at the House Small Business Committee week ago, 2 weeks ago, week and a half ago, there was multiple witnesses, right, spoke about the importance of the rule of two. Now, in that hearing, it appeared that it was coming more from the Democratic side than the Republican side of that committee. But I will note that the Senate bill referenced here was introduced in a bipartisan manner. And so there is strong bipartisan support there on the Senate side. And I've talked to representatives from both sides of the aisle on the Senate side, and they agree, not just the people that sponsored the bill, but others agree that this is an important issue. We'll stay tuned for the overhaul part 19, and we'll also look at supporting some of these bills. So on the House side, this is just some more information. It codifies the rule of two. It maintains that the idea of small business set-asides are still a fair competition, and it promotes this economic growth, right? And the expansion of the industrial base through small business set-asides. And that's very similar. Now, this was through the Democratic representative. However, the Senate bill, as I noted, was introduced by the Democrats and Republicans. So you've got Murkowski and Sullivan in Alaska, and you've got Senator Booker and Senator Markey. So this is coming from multiple folks, and this is just the people that sponsored the bill. Like I said, there are others that support it. So the idea here is to keep pushing this and make sure that everyone's voice is heard. So there's this understanding on both sides. And some of the folks I've spoken with are not these sponsors. So again, I'll note that it's coming from other places. And if you're going to reach out and talk to folks about things, or for folks who don't know, this is the rule of two. And like I already said, if there's a reasonable expectation that two or more small businesses will be able to propose on something at a fair and reasonable price, it requires it to be set aside. That's what the rule of two is. And you'll see here, or the lack of any sort of restriction means that it's not just relegated to a specific price. Whereas if you eliminate the rule of two, there's still a requirement that work that's under the simplified acquisition threshold be set aside. And that threshold has been increased from 250,000 to 350,000. Now, that's pretty small, right? And that's for the essentially the entire contract value. So if you've got a scenario where you've got a base period that's 300,000, and then you have a four option periods that are each 300,000, then that contract would be above the simplified acquisition threshold. And if the rule of two is completely eliminated, then yes, it would no longer require that to be set aside, or for the government to even undertake any sort of RFI or market research to verify that small businesses can't do the work. And that's really the main issue, is that the rule of two requires the government to go through the process of doing market research to make a determination as to whether there are small businesses out there that can do this work at a fair and reasonable price. And if there are, it's supposed to be set aside. That will still be the case for things below that 350,000, but as we all know, there aren't many contracts that are of import that are that small. And if the rule is eliminated or relegated to only those smaller contracts, you might actually see an uptick in certain protests if agencies are attempting to get around it by making a bunch of smaller procurements or something like that, which is why the rule of two, as it currently exists, should be codified. And it's important that everyone on the House and the Senate side hear from folks to codify it, because without it, it's going to be these smaller contracts that are more important. Because as I noted with this, you've got this simplified acquisition threshold that's increasing, but it's not increasing that much. And if the rule of two is relegated to only these amounts, it's going to be fairly limited in its impact. There will be other inflationary adjustments that change things, it increases things, but at the end of the day, and any of these numbers are going to be somewhat inconsequential, because when you're talking about a lot of these awards that many small businesses are going after, even task orders under IDIQ contracts and things of that nature, they usually greatly exceed in total contract value, meaning base plus all options, all of these thresholds. So again, that's why it's important that the rule of two continue to be codified. Also, there's been a lot of talk and confusion about some of the 8A increases. And as I alluded to this before, this idea that this always seems to get out there and confuse a lot of 8A companies or cause confusion more broadly in the government contracting community. But that these increases of from 25 to 30, or from 100 million to 150 million for DoD procurements, that change is for tribal 8As, ANCs, which is Alaska Native Corporations, or for NHOs, not for just standard 8A companies. The standard 8A company threshold is still 4.5 million for services and 7 million for manufacturing. So anything above that threshold that goes to a standard 8A company would still be considered a sole source award that requires a justification and authorization be written. It's only the tribes, ANCs, NHOs that have these much higher standards. Now, that too is something that has been discussed, and it started to get some traction last year, but then faded out, especially given that it was an election year and it just sort of died on the vine. So that might be another thing to push. We might have another opportunity to try to see if in either the coming years or potentially sometime in the future to change this idea of the sole source threshold to make it so that potentially instead of 4.5 million for the entire contract, maybe it's 4.5 million for every year or 5 million per year. So if you have a 1 plus 4, it'd be 25 million, right? Or maybe even bring it up to 6 million years to bring it up to the 30 million, right? To make parity. There's been talk of that too. But to be clear, none of that has really gone anywhere yet. So as of now, these threshold changes and these numbers that I have up here are really for the tribal ANC and NHO scenarios. Otherwise, right, if you're looking at other than full and open competition thresholds, which are different from all the thresholds I was just talking about. So these are not like general set-asides and the sole source procurements that are allowed under the 8A program. This is for everything else, that those thresholds were increased as well, but those are usually immaterial because they tend to be competed anyway in the small business space. The other thing I'll note too is that there's been some talk about expanding the sole source authority for woman-owned and hub zone and serviceable vet, as opposed to just 8A when it comes to not requiring J&As. Because currently for any program that's not 8A, even under the current FAR Part 19 rules, the contracting officer has to go out and attempt to compete something first and have a good faith belief that two or more small businesses can perform the work. And only after doing that analysis, let's say they set it aside for hub zone, they have to think they're going to get two or more hub zones. And then when they go out and solicit it or they get information back and they find that, oh, only one hub zone responded, they're allowed to sole source that award, not put it out again for competition, but they have to go through that process. Whereas for 8A, the big difference is whether it's a standard 8A under that 4.5 or 7 million, or it's a tribal 8A at the below 30 or 150, they can just make the award and not do a J&A. So it's just a higher threshold and they don't have to go through those competition steps when you're dealing with an 8A company. So that's really the distinction between 8A and non-8A and tribal and or ANC, NHO and non-tribal 8A companies. The other thing with TINA, and I know it's not called that anymore, I always joke that it just with the truthful pricing and negotiate, whatever it's called now, is not as fun to say or as easy as an acronym. It doesn't sound as nice. So I keep saying TINA, which is Truth and Negotiation Act, which is what it used to be called, that those thresholds have also been increased. And that is also important because if it's above the threshold, you are supposed to provide certified cost and pricing data. And so you don't have to do that for a little bit higher contracts now in awards. The simplified acquisition procedures have also been increased, and the subcontracting plan thresholds have been increased. So if you're a small business that is transitioning and becoming a large business, or on a particular contract you're recertifying, which triggers these small business subcontracting plan requirements, you can note as well that those thresholds have been increased for standard contracts and then also for construction. It's gone up a little bit more. So I don't know if we have like other, let me see if we have questions from folks. Otherwise,
We do have one question, but mostly asking for address of the subcommittee we need to write to and whether we should write to the House or also some Senate subcommittees.
Yeah, I would definitely write to both the House and the Senate. And I would specifically say, too, that folks should write to their own senators and congressmen as well, not just the committee. And we can certainly get the committee information for you. I believe we did have a blog, PilieroMazza. We put out a blog article on that too. So I'll make sure we can get that around to everyone, maybe as a follow-up for the whole
Yeah, I do
group.
have it with me, but we'll verify that with you before when we send out or we let you guys know where the recording is posted and the slides. We'll include that in there. But I do know if you go to senate.gov, which unfortunately I'm not able to right now because I'm using secure VPN. It's blocking me, but senate.gov, and you'll find your local representatives your state representatives to write to.
And I do know they've been hearing from people both from like the lobbying side. There's been some fairly intensive lobbying efforts on some of this stuff. And also just generally, I think there's been a lot of people who have responded. And if you go, it's on YouTube, also the committee hearing. There was a push, and it's depending on which side, right? There seemed to be more of a push, like I said, from the Democratic side, specifically on this rule of two, and eliciting testimony from witnesses about the importance of the rule of two. But I didn't see or hear anything while I was at the hearing about even from like the Republican side, right, pushing against it. It was just that from the Republican members of the committee, the focus was about statutes that they introduced, looking to streamline regulations, which is also not a bad thing. In particular, it was streamlining procurement regulations and the idea of using simple language when soliciting work. So putting together RFPs and those sorts of things to make sure that the language in those RFPs or RFQs was clear, and anyone from any walk of life or level of education was another thing they talked about, or different industries or people that have never worked for the government before, right? Could come forward and understand what was being asked for and put something together to propose to get more competition. And it was focused on small business, right? Because it was a small business committee. So that is something as well, that to the extent that one of your representatives is someone who is looking to uh, push forward that bill, right? About streamlining acquisitions and use of plain language and those sorts of things. Or think about it as well, depending on where you live. Are your representatives Democratic representatives or are they Republican representatives? Are they more aligned to this administration or are they not aligned with this administration? And focusing the language and what you're using on what will resonate with them. So, like one example, I guess I could give is if you look at some information that I put out a blog a couple weeks ago, maybe longer than that now, about how to truly make America great, right? If you want to truly make America great, the road to that is through supporting small businesses for all the various reasons that I think everybody knows and have heard many times, where those businesses, especially in the federal space, small businesses are required to be owned, generally speaking, especially if it's 8A, woman-owned, serviceable vet or hub zone, but 51% by US citizens. So you've got this crossover there of the administration wanting to support American citizens to bring work back to the United States, bring manufacturing back, but just jobs generally, maintaining jobs and revenue and all the fruits of the labor and the expense of the federal taxpayer, right? To keep as much of that income in the United States, which I know many other countries have been dealing with for years, with like flight of capital and flight of educated personnel and all that kind of stuff, right? Is sort of the opposite, where we're thinking about that and the administration is thinking about that. And so if you know that, focusing what you're saying on that angle, right? Talking about it from that perspective. Whereas if you live in Massachusetts, let's say, that's somewhere where you probably don't have to go through as much of that because it's more obvious, and the your senators and potentially, depending on where you live, your representatives are might be more aligned already with the idea that, look, we already know we're going to support small businesses. It might even be knee-jerk reaction, right? I've heard that this administration's folks that are rewriting the FAR against it are going to potentially change the rule of two, so I'm automatically against it. I don't even know what it means because I'm on the other team or whatever. Then that makes it sort of easier to deal with. But even if you're somewhere like some of the folks I've been talking to in Iowa, the representatives there, they're also in support of all this when it's explained to them what the rule of two is and the potential implications. You can focus on that kind of language. Or if you're a small business and you want to talk to them about some of this stuff, think about where are people hired, right? Where does all the money go? Where do the bonuses go? Or even if the owner is keeping the money and they're going to retire, it's much more likely that an owner of a small business is going to, who, let's say somebody lives in Iowa, we'll use that as an example. The owner of a small business in Council Bluffs who's lived in Council Bluffs their entire lives and their kids are growing up there and everything else, when they retire, they're probably going to retire in Council Bluffs, or maybe they'll go to Florida, right? They're probably not moving to France or somewhere offshore, and they're not most likely moving large sums of money offshore or paying out large sums to shareholders that are not US citizens, right? So when you think about that is then future and ongoing support for the American economy by providing opportunities to small businesses. You're not just keeping taxpayer funds in the United States, which then gets spent on mortgages and car loans and going out to eat dinner and house repairs and every groceries and everything else that people buy right here, right? So you're just sort of recycling the funds inside of the United States, which, by the way, gets every transaction generally gets taxed. So then the government gets a cut of all the money it's already spending. So the reality of it is when the government spends $1, they're probably going to get 60 cents, 70 cents, who knows, back again at some point in the chain, just from the taxes that get taken off, and the states are going to benefit. So like all of these issues, whereas if you're spending money on large multinationals that are publicly traded companies, who knows who the owners are, right? And the dividends or the increases in stock price and all of that is going to inure to the benefit of potential non-citizens who are owners. So think about like those sorts of arguments or those sorts of issues as well when you're talking to folks or when you're writing letters, when you're putting things together. Like it can't just be a boilerplate. And that's the other thing I've talked to a number of people about is everybody wants like the easy button. Well, those easy buttons, they get ignored, is the reality of it. So when you have a scenario like now I'm blanking on the internet stuff that was going on a few years ago, you had like various late night programs where they said, "Hey, you got to support this." And the open internet stuff. So here's a boilerplate letter. Go on this website. You can download the letter and then you can send it to your representative. That kind of stuff doesn't get you very far because when they get, even if they got 10 million letters, if they're all the same letter and you just put the name on it, or, even worse, it was just like, click here, fill out the information, and we'll auto send a letter that has 100 bazillion signatures on it. That kind of thing is easily ignored. So taking the time to actually write something and make it personal while also tailoring it to some of the things that I was talking about is, I think, very important when you're dealing with the individuals in the House and Senate side or any of your representatives, because you need to show them that you care and you care enough to take the time, as opposed to just they're getting flooded and now they're just annoyed because they're getting a flood of letters that are all the same and they can tell that they're all the same letters and they're just going to throw them away. So just really think about that as you're going forward and working or talking with folks to push these ideas forward. I think that's also very important, as we're
And
also waiting to see what happens with FAR Part 19 and the NDAA and some of these bills that were presented. So that we're, pushing for all angles simultaneously.
yeah, and thank you. I really appreciate you mentioning that care about the topic when you're writing, not just because you want to customize a letter, but because you should care. It impacts your business. And so you should know how these changes affect you. So, yeah, hopefully that helped out. There is one more question here that says, would you please explain when contingency SATs are used? I am not familiar with what that phrase means. Contingency SATs.
Yeah, here, let me go back to this one. Contingency operations. So that's a scenario where, like, for instance, it was used a lot during the COVID stuff. If you have a scenario where there's sort of an immediate need to acquire things and to keep things moving on a contingency basis, meaning like an emergency basis or something of that nature. It can be used for other things, but that's sort of the most common, is during those kinds of procedures, or even like shutdowns, which that's something that we might need to think about again too. Those sorts of things. The simplified acquisition threshold is now $1 million. So if there's some sort of critical need and they have to keep things moving, that being said, for really critical stuff, it's not that hard to do a justification and authorization also for things that are well above $1 million. So when you're dealing with something that, if there's going to be a shutdown and there's going to be life or limb that is going to be put in harm's way, those sorts of things they usually just do a justification authorization for contracts of almost in any size. I mean, they can't go on forever, but it's just one of those types of issues. So it's fairly limited, but I've seen it being used more and more often just because of shutdowns and, with COVID and other things of that nature that are really important. Or some of the hurricanes, you've seen some of that too. I saw this used in that context as well, and outside of the context of needing a justification and authorization at all for those.
Very good. I think those are all the questions that we got externally, and we're up on the hour mark here. Sai, I do have a curious question. Which university do you teach at? Because I want to take your classes. You are an amazing professor. If you aren't one, you should be one. I always enjoy learning from you. So thank you so much for sharing the knowledge and just even going through the basics, right? The whole hierarchy of how this even works, because I don't think a lot of us even understand how the hierarchy is structured, and we have those knee-jerk reactions to every LinkedIn post that shows up and goes, oh my God, everything is changing, the sky is falling. So thank you for explaining that. I don't see any other questions that we have not answered. Folks, last chance. If not, Sai, I would like to again thank you for taking the time to be with us. And you're right, we will do one in the near future as we see more changes to the FAR coming up. So folks, any more questions? All right. Thank you, Sai, and thank you all for attending and staying throughout the presentation. So thank you all, and we'll see you all next time. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.